All right, so when we get a blood type mismatch, this will cause what's called agglutination. So agglutination is like the clumping together of our blood cells. So if you are a person who's A positive, and we load you up with, you get in the ambulance and they load you up with B positive blood, then all of your anti-B antibodies are going to bind up all of those cells. And with that structure of the antibody, it's got two binding regions. So what happens is we bind the A surface antigen on one blood cell, the B surface antigen on another blood cell, and we clump all of these cells together then. These antibodies will come together, and so now we'll just like stick this whole big group of cells together and agglutinate, and then if we get this big group of blood cells stuck together, then they can clog vessels and it can cause death. So that's why it's really important to make sure that you have a blood type match when you're getting blood. That's what makes O blood so valuable. They don't even have to think about it. They can just give it to anybody. All right, any questions so far? All right, so for our leukocytes are our white blood cells. And we can categorize them into two groupings based on how they stain. We've got cells that are called granulocytes, and they've got granules that pick up a specific type of dye. And so that'll help them to be distinguished from other cell types because you can see the way that they're staining. So we'll say they contain granules that pick up specific dyes. And the types of cells that are granulocytes are called neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Neutrophils' biggest job is to be phagocytic for bacteria. So they eat bacteria. So they're phagocytic, meaning that they eat things up. And what they eat is bacteria. So they're phagocytic for bacteria. And neutrophils are the highest white blood cells floating around at any moment by quantity in the blood. And so they gobble up bacteria. They're the major component of pus. We'll talk about the specific ways that they work to create pus on Monday when we start talking about physiology. Like you have a big huge whitehead on your face, it's a bunch of neutrophils in there. There was some bacteria that crawled down your hair, got into your hair follicle, started gobbling up all that protein-rich sebum, and so then your neutrophils come in to fight it, and they do this thing called respiratory burst, which is basically kill themselves and everybody else around them and make a lot of pus. So that's what they do. Our eosinophils have a couple jobs. They're going to fight parasitic worms. They don't do it by eating them, but I see eosinophil and I think eat parasitic worm. They don't. They release cytotoxins that paralyze parasitic worms. So they fight parasitic worms. And they do that by releasing cytotoxins that paralyze them. Another thing that they do is they gobble up antigen-antibody complexes after a specific immune response. So they phagocytize antigen-antibody complexes. And an antigen-antibody complex would just be you have some specific immune response going. So antibodies are produced in response to a specific type of pathogen. And you'll make a specific antibody for that specific antigen. So after a specific immune response is over, eosinophil level will go up, and they will gobble up those antigen-antibody complexes. That's one way that we can remove our antigens from the system. Then the last type of granulocytes are the basophils. These release histamine and heparin, which are involved in the inflammatory response. So these are going to be involved in like allergic reactions. So you'll have a lot of these around when you have an allergy. Histamine is called heparin. And this is going to slow clot formation as well. Histamine and heparin are both involved in the inflammatory response. So when you have allergies, and you're having an allergic response and you're releasing a bunch of histamine, it helps to take an antihistamine because it blocks that. And then you'll decrease like swelling in your nose, decrease mucus production, things like that. So, I'm sorry, our histamine is going to do another thing that is important in our inflammatory response, which is act as a vasodilator. So that can be what's so annoying about allergies, is that you dilate all those blood vessels, it causes swelling, you get lots of blood to the area, lots of mucus to the area, but then the heparin will slow our clot formation so that we can get other immune cells to the area. Antihistamines are going to stop that vasodilation and help to kind of slow the response so that you aren't having this really blown out of proportion immune response. And our allergens generally are things like pollen, which aren't really pathogenic. So that can be something that's really annoying for people who have allergies. All right, our next type of cells by category are called agranulocytes. And they have granules, but they're not picking up a specific type of dye. So we'll say they don't pick up a specific dye. And there are two types of agranulocytes. Well, there are actually, if you break it down, there are more than two types, because our first category are our lymphocytes. And we've got three types of lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are cells that are involved in the specific immune response, or are natural killer cells. So these are involved in specific immunity. So we've got B lymphocytes that are going to be producing our antibodies in response to things like, to all of our extracellular pathogens. And then we've got T lymphocytes, which respond to intracellular pathogens. And then our natural killer cells, they're an innate cell that's not really involved in specific immunity. They're going to be phagocytic for cancer cells and things like that, but we'll talk more about the specifics when we get to the immune system. And then the other types of agranulocytes are called monocytes. These are the biggest immune cells, and they become macrophages in the tissue. Macro means big, phages means to eat, so these are big eaters. They will eat anything that is not you. So you get a splinter, macrophages will go and try and gobble it up. You get a cut and some bacteria comes in, macrophages will go and gobble it up, and then they become antigen-presenting cells for our specific cells. Again, we'll talk about the specifics when we get to the immune system.
The agranulocytes are part of the leukocytes, right?
Yeah. So as far as leukocytes go, we just categorize them into granulocytes and agranulocytes. We've got three types of granulocytes, the neutrophils, and they're neutrophils because they bind neutral dye. Eosinophils, they bind a specific dye called eosin. Basophils binds basic dye. Our agranulocytes aren't picking up a specific dye. They do stain, but they're just not picking up a specific dye. Our lymphocytes are involved in specific immunity, and our monocytes are the cells that are going to become macrophages in the tissue. White blood cells, their job is to fight pathogens in the tissue. So they are not really floating around the blood in high concentrations. When you're sick, your buffy coat might be a little bit bigger, and you can tell what kind of sickness you have based on which type of cell is present in the highest amount. But their job is in the tissue, so they migrate out of the blood and enter the tissue through a process called diapedesis. I'll see if I can find a video on it. It's really cool. They like squeeze out between your epithelial cells and squash out to get to the tissues. It's really cool to watch. All right, the last of our formed elements are platelets. Platelets are involved in blood clot formation. So they're going to be really important. We'll talk about how they're formed when we talk about hematopoiesis on Monday. But they are cell fragments that come from these cells called megakaryocytes, and they're going to do a bunch of stuff that's involved in clotting. So their big job is to help with clotting. So first we'll say they're cell fragments. They're involved with clotting, and they've got some important functions that they do. So the first thing that they're going to do is they secrete vasoconstrictors that will help to constrict a blood vessel that has been damaged so that we don't lose too much blood. So this will stimulate constriction of broken blood vessels. Another thing that they do is they stick to each other, and they stick to collagen in damaged tissues to form what's called a platelet plug. So they stick to collagen and each other to form a platelet plug. This is one of the steps in stopping bleeding. We'll talk about that more on Monday. The third thing that they're going to do is secrete procoagulants that will help with clotting. After you're done with the clot, they secrete an enzyme that helps to break down the clot. They secrete these things called chemotactic factors. Chemotaxis is like chemical taxiing. So you secrete chemical messages that are going to cause other cells to move to the area. So they secrete chemotactic factors that attract neutrophils and monocytes. Why would we want to get neutrophils and monocytes to the area? If we've broken a blood vessel, then we can get these two cells there. Neutrophils will help gobble up any bacteria that may have come through that injury, and the monocytes will gobble up anything foreign. So our platelets are going to be important for secreting those chemotactic factors that are going to bring those other innate immune cells to the area. We've got, let's see. I have another blank slide. Come on. I don't. Okay, so I'll write our last two functions of platelets over on this board. To some degree, they can internalize and destroy bacteria. To a very small degree. And then after you're all done with the clot and you've broken it down, they can secrete growth factors that will stimulate mitosis in the fibroblasts of the connective tissue so that we can start healing and repairing those blood vessels. So the last function is they'll secrete growth factors that will help with tissue repair by stimulating mitosis in our fibroblasts. This will help repair our broken vessels. So for being just cell fragments, they really do a lot of important stuff for the body. So they're pretty cool little cell fragments.